Welcome to our video series, Hiding Behind the Mask, Conversations on Shame and Narcissism, combining psychological and spiritual perspectives. This is a 12-part series moderated by Dr. Kristen Seavey and featuring the insight of Reverend Robert Hirschfield, Episcopal Bishop of New Hampshire, and Dr. Patricia Gianotti, clinical psychologist and author. Each video segment will begin with a brief introduction by Dr. Seavey, where she will describe an overview of the content material. At the end of each section, a set of questions will appear on your screen. These questions are meant for personal reflection, or you may use the questions as a springboard for small group discussion. We hope you enjoy this series. And now, Dr. Seavey.
The first question from our audience addresses how entitled behavior is an expression of narcissism. Although narcissistic grandiosity often manifests when individuals internalize a belief that they are unworthy, grandiose entitlement can also develop as a result of parents over-gratifying a child's every wish and demand.
Yes, this is for Patricia. I think hearing you describe these defenses, I'm a therapist, and it's helped me understand entitlement when I see it in my therapy clients, and it's probably the hardest thing for me to work with as a therapist. But could you talk a little bit about that, and could you elaborate a little bit?
So the question is to explain more about entitlement?
Entitlement as a piece of this discussion in narcissism, because I think it's on the same continuum.
Mm-hmm. It is. Well, I think the grandiose type is entitled. I think you see that more full-blown than the other two types that I described. But I guess I would answer that in a couple of different ways, depending on how someone was parented. So let's say someone was deprived, or even let's talk about deprived, that there's a longing and a desire to make up for lost time, secretly in there, hanging in there. And so when is it my turn? It's got to be my turn. And particularly if there's a punishing parent who behaved in a very entitled way, and the rules didn't apply to them as a parent, that they got to do whatever they wanted, but the thumb was on the child, and they couldn't do anything, and they were overly controlled. Oftentimes when those children grow up, that wish for their turn to be nurtured and given what they need displays itself as entitlement, as opposed to actually getting in touch with the pain around the longing of the abuse of what happened in childhood, and how horrible it was that they were treated the way they were treated. And so the overcompensation is, it's my turn now. I'm going to replicate some of that. I'm going to model what was modeled to me. But it happens through entitlement as opposed to really satisfying the need for attachment, the need for a secure attachment. And so it plays itself out through entitlement as opposed to getting in touch with the very human longing that we all have to attach and connect and feel safe and have and make relationship in very meaningful ways. So the other way that entitlement can play itself out is, let's say a parent thinks that the child is the gift from God, and they gratify every single desire and every single whim that child has, and there really are no limits. And so the child doesn't learn the sense of mutuality, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, because they're so gratified. And that the parent, sometimes helicopter parents, will do whatever they can to protect the child from having to feel any pain, any suffering, any consequence for bad action. And so what gets taught and what gets instilled in that type of grandiose presentation is, well, this is how I've always been treated. Why should it be any different when I grow up? Why should there be limitations on me and consequences on me in the workforce? my mother and father always got me out of it. And so you see that abrupt coming to terms with overindulgent parenting, where there isn't really a way that a balance around, yes, you have a right to live into your dreams and all of your potential, but so does everybody else. And you treat people with kindness, and you don't talk that way to Johnny. He's just as important as you are. And unless that piece of it is taught to our children, they're going to grow up having that expectation as if it's normal fare.
So I could see that Bishop Rob, you might have the opportunity from the pulpit, although you've now sort of taken on other duties in the church besides preaching all the time. Well, you do preach.
There are a few priests in the audience who've had to bear with my homilies in their own churches. So.
It's a powerful pulpit
Yeah.
from which some of these issues can be addressed to folks who are, well, all of us, shamed in some way, have been shamed, and yet may seek reparation in inappropriate ways. And how, one of my big questions is how the church can be part of a conversation around repairing some of that, and what, how to speak to those issues from the position that you're in. It's tricky when clergy folks or other leaders also suffer from these issues, so this is where it just gets really tricky.
Yeah, it is tricky. I think there are probably a couple strategies or venues where that conversation, those conversations could take place. I don't know if it's necessarily the pulpit, the physical pulpit in preaching, except when one discloses one's own struggles with entitlement or privilege. We're talking a lot about, especially white privilege these days, and how, to borrow the title of a book that's been recently published, that so many of us, myself included, were born on third base. You know, we are almost around to the home run, and we have this sort of built-in myth in us that that things are supposed to come easy for us. And when we share that, when we share our own comeuppance of that phenomenon, or when we recognize that indeed we are dependent upon a whole society which is broken, flawed, we've benefited from it in ways that are deeply unfair and unjust, we can crack that open. And those conversations are happening, and I can tell you, it's very threatening. It is very threatening to people who are listening to us, because they really
They're afraid.
They're afraid. They're afraid, and it's as though by saying that we're saying that they're anything less than beautiful, or they're anything less than that there's something less than being created in the image of God. Even though what we're also saying, and we're trying to underscore, is that actually there are whole races and classes and backgrounds of people inhabiting this world who are also created in the image of God, and who have not benefited from the same. But that, I think it strikes on a kind of shame. One of the motivations for writing about shame is my own recognizing my own learned racism, and discovering that that's something for which I am deeply ashamed. And events in my life where I've behaved in ways that are ignorant, cruel, insensitive, have led me to a sense of deep remorse, which has even gone so far as to be a shame. So, I think to the extent that we can be, what I'm hearing Patricia talk about is the invulnerability of narcissism, that it's a protection against vulnerability. which goes, whenever I hear the word vulnerability, I go to the etymology of that word. Vulnerability comes from the root of that is the verb to vuln, V-U-L-N. I think that's it. And to vuln is what a pelican does in order to feed her young. She actually plucks at her own breast, at least in the Christian mythology, in order to share her own blood. She opens a crack in herself in order to share nourishment for her brood. And this is ancient Christian iconography of the Christ event, where God's self becomes broken, shows vulnerability, shows limits, takes on our flesh, as we said in the incarnation, in order to heal our shame. So that, to what extent are we inviting our congregations into a time of vulnerability? That's, to me, is the meaning of the Jesus movement that our presiding bishop talks about. Not so much the church, which is a pile of invulnerable bricks, but human beings in relationship, open to one another and sharing stories of pain and redemption. By the way, I was healed with my father. My father and I got along okay in the end. It was a famous Thanksgiving Day joke about what happened in the dermatologist's office, and he, so there was a sense of healing, redemption.
Right.
The following questions are meant to stimulate personal reflection or small group discussion. We encourage you to capture a screenshot of these questions and use them for future reference. To order Dr. Gianotti's books, please contact the following websites. And Reverend Hirschfield's book is available through churchpublishing.org.